G'day folks, ZiggyD here, back from another incredible Exilecon trip. There's a lot to digest with the Path of Exile 2 stuff that has been showcased and announced and that I have personally had a chance to experience. But today I want to just focus on the combat in particular, my experience with the demos as well. And some of my discussions with the developers, I think, about those demos that might give a little bit of extra interesting insights. I did have a good chance to talk to people like Neon and Jonathan about some of my experiences with the demos. Now, unfortunately, we weren't allowed to record gameplay from the event, so we'll have to just run some footage from the Exilecon stream and YouTube videos in the background while I discuss my thoughts and experiences. And a big thing I want you to keep in mind with any Path of Exile 2 discussion is that it's very much looking like its own separate game. I've seen plenty of people, myself included, looking at various things in the context of Path of Exile 1 and saying things like, you know, this thing's nerfed, yada yada. But really, a lot of the changes to Path of Exile 2 only really make sense in the context of what GGG is trying to achieve with Path of Exile 2 and with all of the other interconnected changes that go into that. This does mean, however, that they are trying to do a whole lot of things all at once with the combat. Changing animations, crowd control, flask, mana, movement, and even just fundamentally what it means to fight monsters in Path of Exile. And while overall I am really impressed with a lot of what I played and saw, and while I do really like what they're going for, the truth is that not all of it worked very well. Some of the demos did not showcase well on stream or in person, and not all of the changes quite work, at least not yet. So first let's talk about what did work well. The visuals. Environment, monsters, abilities, characters, everything looks phenomenal. You have to somewhat take my word for this because things definitely look better in person than they do in stream or video footage like this that's been rendered 2 or 3 times at this point. But I'm sure you can at least get an idea that everything looks pretty damn incredible. At worst, it's like the best visual parts of PoE 1, and at best, it's a generational leap forwards in visuals. Often overlooked and very worth mentioning is also the sound. And the sound balancing on some of the streams wasn't very good, which doesn't really help with your maybe experiences from home. But damn, in person with noise-cancelling headphones on playing the demo, the combat and the music was mind-blowing. The warrior, especially with its very chunky hammer skills, sounded so good. So the audio-visual side of things was really top-notch, and that obviously has a huge impact on how good it feels to play the game, as a great skill with poor visuals and sound effects will actually just feel like a bad skill, really. So it's awesome how good that is at this point, still a year out from the beta. But let's focus more on the gameplay side of things. So, big picture, GGG is rightfully taking Path of Exile 2, especially now that it's its own game, and using it as an opportunity to really redo combat from the ground up. The goal does seem to be, to make combat a bit slower. It's true. But mainly, I think it's about making it have some actual interactivity. For the player to be able to see what's going on and to engage in something of a back and forth with monsters, and to be able to have a reason to use a more diverse set of skills and to change tactics on the fly. They're trying to give the opportunity to combo skills together and use utility or different styles of skills in different tactical situations, whilst also trying to avoid players just repeating the spam of a single skill. Let's face it, Path of Exile has a reputation for that, and it doesn't always look good to everyone, even if it is some people's preferred playstyle, the one button spam. But they're also trying to avoid things like a preset skill rotation like what you see in cooldown heavy MMOs as well, and I think that's rather important. They talked specifically in one of the panels about cooldowns often being the laziest way to solve this problem, and that's interesting because I was really in favor of the idea of cooldowns before I really thought about that, because it is a cheap way of enforcing skill variety. If you put everything on cooldowns, you are forced to use different skills, so that's better than no variety. So it can be a cheap solution in that regard. But rightfully, they talked about the idea that what can be done with the cooldown can often be done better in other ways, making skills a little bit more different so that you need to use them in different situations, or you want to use them in different situations. Instead of giving Leap Slam a cooldown, make it really powerful, but make it really expensive or something like that instead, so that you can use it end-to-end without a cooldown, but doing so is going to drain a lot of your mana, and then you have to think about that. So very interesting stuff. So I like the approach they're taking to this. Overall, this is a lofty set of goals, and there's a lot that has to go into it. Where they're going with this is indeed quite different from where Path of Exile 1 is at the moment, And for sure, some people will prefer to continue playing a simpler zoom zoom explode screens style of game. A big reason why I think they've separated the games and will continue developing Path of Exile 1 for players who prefer that playstyle. They're becoming different games and going in different directions here. So with that context, let's talk a bit about my experience with the demos and how well I think they're achieving some of these goals. The big winner here was the boss fights for sure. I love boss fights in Path of Exile. They can be big highlights of the game. Fighting those uber bosses and whatnot is extremely satisfying, and I'm very excited to see a stronger boss fight focus moving forwards here with Path of Exile 2. But really, their vision for what they want to do with combat in PoE 2 really comes alive just so well in these boss fights. They were definitely quite hard and perhaps at times tuned to be a little too long, but they felt the good, fair kind of difficult in my opinion. They all have like a bunch of different abilities and there's almost no boss auto attack spam. Using your dodge roll, taking advantage of your stun or freeze or other crowd controls, and timing your big abilities or combos well really was key, and it came together to feel really fun and cool. I kind of mentioned this before, but playing the warrior once you got the hang of it and doing well against one of the bosses reminded me a lot of playing like Hammer in Monster Hunter and actually being good at it, which is a key point there. It's chunky, satisfying, and it really rewards your knowledge of both the bosses and their attacks, but also your character and your own abilities and how they work together in concert. And the gameplay is actually quite fast once you get it all down. It's interesting, this idea of like Path of Exile 2 being slower, because in some ways, certainly it is slower, but in some other ways, it's quite fast. And that's the idea of like maybe the fights themselves take longer, but there's more back and forth happening in those fights that leads to the game actually feeling quite fast, while not necessarily looking as fast, because you're not, zooming, blowing stuff. You can see what's happening. But it still feels like fast gameplay in the same way of like a good Dark Souls boss fight feeling fast, or a good Monster Hunter encounter feeling fast. Despite individual moments like a skill taking longer to complete, the combat can still feel quite fast. Interesting concept I'm still kind of mulling over in my mind, but definitely one that I started to get a feel for there, especially in those boss fights. And I will say that once you do learn the boss and your skills, the boss fights can actually be quite a bit faster than what was shown in the various showcases. For example, bursting down 20 to 30% of the boss's life bars with a well-timed ability combo definitely happened to me quite a bit. Watching the streamer and dev showcases, I did feel like, as a spectator, the player was dealing way too little damage, and it felt a bit painful and kind of dragged on at times, especially, after Jonathan had to like take down the boss for the second time, and it was kind of just chipping away at it slowly. Now for the dev showcases, I think this was a combination of nerves, but also wanting to like show off the boss's attacks, etc. For the streamer showcases though, I think that it's because they didn't really get a chance to practice the fights beforehand for most of the streamers' cases, and they didn't really get a chance to get an understanding of their skills properly. Even Crip, for example, who did a really good job with his showcase, didn't actually figure out how to charge up the whirling slash ability on the Huntress, which deals a lot of damage in a large AoE when stacked up. I can't really blame him really, I only figured out that skill by accident. GGG really should have had a dev with each of the streamers' showcases to help explain things and backseat a little bit. Nugian's one, for example, was one of the best showcases actually, as he'd gotten a bit of demo time in beforehand, and he had Neon there to explain how the different skills worked on the warrior and how they came together and how that worked in the context of the game. I think the demonstration definitely benefited a lot from that. It's a shame that was like at the end of Exilecon. That was one of the last showcases. If they had done that for all of them, I think it would have been a much better showcase overall. One of my favorite things about bossing in Path of Exile 2 is that new crowd control system. Instead of things like freeze and stun being this binary thing where it either works or, as it is in most cases in boss fight, it simply doesn't, you can now actually build up towards a stun or a freeze. Brilliant. And then when these do happen on bosses, they actually last for a long time, between like 3 and 8 seconds, for example, for the stuns, depending on the boss. With how tight the boss fights are, these moments are crucial, and you really want to capitalize on them to either pull off a big damage combo or one of those big charge up attacks, or to escape and heal in some cases. It's such a good change, this being able to build up towards a crowd control effect on a boss and actually having it be meaningful. It's so much better than what we have currently in Path of Exile. And I also like it as like a kind of more elegant Path of Exile style implementation of the stagger bar concept, rather than just distilling everything down to a stagger. Actually making these different things different, but be able to apply potentially all of them through boss fights. Very cool. So overall, I'm really, really impressed with the bosses themselves, but also with how well GGG's combat vision for Path of Exile 2 works in those boss fights. So I played all 4 of the demos, and I'll give a little bit of a brief review of each to start to give you some context to some of the stuff that I think didn't work so well. The level 1 demo has you on the monk, and that demo is actually really solid and great gameplay showcase. The pacing of the combat, the enemies, and the monk's early options all worked quite well together. I felt the vision kind of worked well here. They didn't show it on stream at all, actually. The monk content they showed, I think, was like Act 3 or something. So I don't even have any footage of that, but it was shown in the previous Exilecons on a different class. The highest level demo was level 45, and that was the warrior with the hammer skills. This is my favorite demo overall for a couple reasons. The hammer skills and the gameplay are very chunky and satisfying. They feel and look and sound so good. The skill package also worked the best overall, and Leap Slam solved an issue that I'll talk about with some of the other demos in a moment. The act itself, though, was also very cool. It had amazing variety where you sail freely between 5 completely different islands in these little bite-sized adventures. Great fun. I was pretty excited about this act because it's kind of like partway through the game. It's supposed to be around roughly where Act 6 is now. So you like kind of go through these like more consistent zones, and then you get to this act, and all of a sudden it seems like it's going to be a bit of a breath of fresh air where there's going to be some nice little episodic adventures for you to go out and sail all between these different islands. It was quite bright and vibrant, and all of them were very different, which was very exciting. So it looks like it's going to be a really strong act. It was really challenging content, and some people did say that the warrior was the hardest. I definitely don't think that's the case. More on that later. But you did really have to learn to use your skills properly. If you didn't, you'd get caught out by normal mobs and bosses both, with slow wind-up skills not going off because you get stunned or something like that. Some of the demos did show some people having mana problems, which occurred typically because skills like Leap Slam and Armor Break were quite expensive if spammed, which is not what they were intended to be used for. Leap Slam, for example, is a stun initiator or an escape, and Armor Break is a combo setup skill. It's not really meant to be spammed as a single target. But these things just aren't immediately obvious when you first sit down. Again, they really should have had a dev alongside the streamer showcases to help with this issue. The biggest complaint with the Act 4 Warrior demo was the first level of the prison for me. It was cramped and you were getting body blocked by mobs. It was really rough in there. And then every 5 steps you had to like walk up to this lever and do this slow leather animation to open up nearby doors. And it was just like a constant spam of that while monsters are attacking you and everything. I just actually quit out of that zone. I went to a different island. I'm like, I'm not wasting my limited and precious demo time flipping levers slowly in here. So I really hope they rework that. I get they're going for like an oppressive prison thing, but it was a bit much. So next up there was an Act 2 Huntress demo with spears starting at level 17. The Huntress is very cool, and I do love spears and I'm excited to see more of them in Path of Exile. The Whirling Slash ability, when properly charged, is really satisfying. You max charge the skill by slashing twice more inside of the whirling storm that it creates, and then moving outside of its area causes it to explode, dealing 300% more damage, chunking boss life bars, and absolutely obliterating packs. It was a great feeling skill, and really comboed quite well with that back hop escape ability. Now that all said, this is where 2 really big issues with the demos and the showcases start to show themselves. Body blocking and hard crowd control like stuns. Getting swarmed, stuck in place, and killed was a problem on every demo, but Huntress and Sorceress were the worst for it. This issue I think is caused by 3 things. Now firstly, the small enemies that you're fighting are still fighting at Path of Exile 1 speeds, despite the player moving at PoE 2 speeds. This alone is not a huge issue by itself, but it does fuel the other issues and makes them much worse. Secondly, there is no way to pass through enemies in any demo besides the Warrior's Leap Slam, which leaps over the top of them. That saved that final demo from a lot of these issues and made it one of the strongest ones as a result. Now, you may point out that the monk had like a whirly ability that allowed them to pass through things, but the Act 1 demo in which you tried the monk, you didn't actually get access to that skill. So the same issue did occur on the monk, but I mentioned that Act 1 worked kind of well, and that's just because there were fewer enemies and they were a bit slower because it's Act 1. So the vision kind of worked a bit better there, and this issue didn't crop up quite as much. The third issue is this highly questionable change to make enemy stuns build up on the player from small chip damage. I don't know about this one. Personally, I think that hard crowd control should never ever happen to players randomly. If you're going to have control ripped out of your hands, it should be done in a signaled way from like a big attack from a boss or a signaled, well showcased ability from an enemy. Some icy enemy builds up a big ice thing that then slams down and that freezes you, where you have signaling and the ability to avoid it. Just random punches from small seagulls and things swarming you should not ever stun or freeze the player, in my opinion. Unfortunately, in the demos, stuns happened very frequently from small enemies, which as far as the player is concerned really is just random and unavoidable. Even if technically it's not random because it's building up on a set and consistent and readable basis, it to the player feels completely random. Now this happened as part of the crowd control changes that I mentioned earlier, where players can build up stuns and things on bosses, which I love for the player doing it to bosses. It's such a good mechanic for that. But tiny enemies building up stuns on the player, I don't think works at all. It felt really awful. Now you'll notice I haven't even began my review of the Sorceress's level 31 demo, and that's because it was just borderline unplayable. The character had no escape skill whatsoever, and the first zone was full of hundreds of insect swarms that would surround, body block, and stun you out of abilities. Your only recourse was to just spam Ice Nova and try and freeze or kill all of the enemies before they could surround you. It really wasn't fun. And then the first zone boss that you encounter there actually had like really high cold resist. It must have been capped or something, which some devs admitted to me when I pulled them over to showcase to them that it might be a bit overtuned because I comboed Frostbomb and a triple casted Ice Meteor and did like 1 pixel of damage. Look, the Sorceress skills look really cool and I was super excited to try it out, but that demo was really, really rough. It was a bad showcase. The Sorceress definitely needs some kind of Frostblink skill. In fact, I think Frostblink would port perfectly well into Path of Exile 2 and is probably balanced for its combat better than Leap Slam is. So you definitely would have benefited from having something like that to escape, and certainly the stun system punished the Sorceress mercilessly. But anyway, back to the Huntress. She does have an escape skill called Impale that causes you to immobilize an enemy and then flip back to safety. 2 problems though, it seemed to get body blocked by enemies, so it was not really usable when surrounded. The other issue is that it requires a target and has a short pure melee range, which meant that you have to step towards an enemy in order to jump back away from the enemy, kind of counterintuitive. I think it either needs to work without a target or maybe have a nice long range, and it definitely needs to let you hop over an enemy or two when you do it. The first boss as the Huntress swarms you with a massive amount of hyenas. If you didn't kill them fast enough, it was incredibly awkward being pinned in place. You may have seen that in the crypt demonstration. In case you were wondering about dodge roll, which I otherwise quite like and thinks works quite well, it does not go through mobs, so you get this very cringe situation of people dodge rolling in place when surrounded and just not going anywhere. I discussed this whole issue of swarming, stuns, and body blocking with some of the devs like Neon and Jonathan at length, and did learn some pretty interesting things. I definitely think they'll be able to get this stuff right over the next year. But these issues definitely did hold the demos and showcases back a lot, in my opinion. The thing is, I think stun, for example, actually really works against their vision for the combat. Getting randomly stunned by small enemies actively detracts from like the meatier, slower, more tactical combat they're going for. If it ends up being left as it is, I think it'll just make stun immunity mandatory. And they're trying to, I think, avoid that like checkbox character design. Personally, I think they should scrap random hard crowd control on players and move much more towards signaled hard crowd control only. Such a change will still have building for resilience to these effects be rewarding, as you'll be able to shrug those off in boss fights and deal more damage as a reward during those phases for building that way. It'll also ensure that things like stun and freeze immunity aren't just mandatory checkboxes for every character, which I think is a good goal to have for PoE 2. My initial suggestion to devs regarding the swarming and body blocking was that dodge roll and more abilities needed phasing to be able to move through monsters. I actually learned from them though that they're working on this pushiness system where abilities and players can push mobs around more, leading to situations where you can push monsters aside to escape. Though it might be harder, for example, if the enemies are heavier, or if they're against a wall, or if there's a bunch of enemies all stacked on top of each other, and so on. Pushiness could even allow dodge roll, for example, to push through small enemies or push them aside to clear a path, which sounds kind of cool. It got me thinking that a combo of pushiness for big, strong characters, and then the ability to slip through or over or between enemies for the more evasive characters could both solve this body blocking issue while further enhancing like the unique feel of different builds and classes. Your warrior, for example, doesn't get body blocked because he just shoves the enemies aside. And then your huntress doesn't get body blocked because they're lithe and acrobatic and they just flip through the enemies and get past them. That could be very cool. I totally get that you don't want players to always be able to escape any bad situation. That's super important because that's what makes it so that how you engage monsters actually matters. But you do need players to have tools to be able to use in these situations, and you never want to take too much control away from the player. It's just not fun. No one enjoys rolling in place or being stunned 4 times in a row while trying to leap slam away from a swarm of seagulls. They really do have to get this balance right, as it's going to be crucial to PoE2's combat. It's definitely not there yet in the demo, but hopefully over the next year in the lead up to the beta, they can really solve these problems, give players tools to continue fighting when surrounded, so that they can get fighting packs of enemies to be anywhere near as satisfying as it is to fight those bosses currently. In some ways, Exilecon 2's showing was more cracked and rough around the edges than Exilecon 1's was. And I think that makes sense. What they were trying to do before was effectively a big polish up and a very large expansion to keep Path of Exile 1 relevant in the coming decade. But what they're trying to do now with Path of Exile 2 is much, much more than that. They're making a whole new game that still manages to keep a lot of the content and progress that Path of Exile 1 has made. It's really quite ambitious. I fully believe that some roughness and things not working well together cohesively right now is fully to be expected. I am overall really impressed with both what is working well and also with what they're going for. But I'm quite curious about what you folks think. Let me know in the comments below. In particular, mention if you watched from home and formed certain opinions, or if you played the demo and formed certain opinions, because I'm quite interested in the variance and difference between those two things, because I think those are very different experiences. I'm curious what you think. Anyway, that's it for now. I'm Ziggy D, and thanks for watching.